France's public debt rises to 3.3 trillion euros at the end of the first quarter of 2025. US President Donald Trump proposes defense budget for fiscal year 2026. And the Bank of Israel acknowledges the 20 billion shekels losses from the 12-day war waged against Iran. Hello, good evening and welcome to the Qnews Economic Bulletin. I'm Mark Summers. We start off with Europe, as European leaders have met in Brussels to tell the EU Commission if they want a quick trade deal with the United States at the cost of Washington getting better terms, or to escalate the fight in hope of something better. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever noted that a trade war makes both sides of the Atlantic poorer and is just stupid, and that he supports the approach of the Commission President. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has highlighted that his government would support the Commission in its efforts to reach a trade agreement with the United States.
Ich unterstütze die EU-Kommission auch bei allen Anstrengungen, jetzt schnell zu einem Handelsabkommen mit den USA zu kommen. Ich möchte, dass wir Mercosur auf den Weg bringen und weitere Handelsabkommen abschließen. Europa steht vor entscheidenden Wochen und Monaten. Die Unterstützung der Bundesregierung der Bundesrepublik Deutschland hat diese Europäische Union, und ich möchte gerne zurück in Brüssel nach vielen, vielen Jahren meinen persönlichen Beitrag dazu leisten, dass Europa erfolgreich in die nächsten Jahre geht. Herzlichen Dank.
German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The European Central Bank Vice President Luis de Guindos has stated that while financial markets had largely taken escalating Middle East conflict in their stride, the situation could nonetheless have a dampening effect on euro area growth. Speaking at a financial event, de Guindos remarked that markets' perception of geopolitical risk had been overall quite benign and found them surprisingly calm, given developments in recent days. However, he explained that markets tend to price geopolitical risks in a binary on and off manner. He concluded by stating that, while it was impossible to predict what would happen, the developments might well have a dampening impact on growth in the euro area. To the UK, and the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey has said that a recent pickup in inflation created more uncertainty about the medium-term picture of price growth. In a speech at a conference held by the British Chambers of Commerce, he also noted signs of a slowdown in the jobs market in Britain. Bailey reiterated the central bank's guidance on borrowing costs, noting that rates were not on a preset path, but were likely to come down gradually. A Confederation of British Industry survey has shown that British retail sales slumped this month, and expectations within the industry for July also deteriorated. The Confederation's monthly gauge of how retail sales compared with a year earlier fell to -46 in June from -27 in May. And a measure of expected sales for July fell to -49 from -37 for June. The French National Institute of Statistics has reported that public debt rose to 3.34 trillion euros at the end of the first quarter of 2020, an increase of 40.5 billion euros compared to the first quarter of 2024. The Institute added that as a percentage of GDP, public debt climbed to 114%, up from 113.2% in the previous quarter. The report also noted that this debt came with a decrease in the general government cash position by 11.4 billion euros and to a lesser extent in other assets. The report stated that as a result, that net debt increased more than gross debt, 52.6 billion euros, and accounted for 106.1% of GDP. The French Finance Ministry has reported that the 2025 budget deficit target is still in reach, but cost overruns mean that an extra 5 billion euros in spending cuts is needed to get there. In a mid-year update on the public finances, the ministry noted that while tax income was so far in line with expectations, spending by some ministries, the health system and municipalities was running slightly over budget. The French government also aims to cut the public sector budget deficit to 5.4% of GDP from 5.8% last year as a first step towards getting back in line with an EU target of no more than 3% by 2029. Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov has revealed that President Putin's proposal of a global growth platform alternative to the West's will be discussed at BRICS at the summit in Brazil. Ushakov also noted that the idea was indeed being discussed, including within the framework of BRICS, adding that a summit in early July would undoubtedly address all these matters. In Asia, China's central bank has conducted a 300 billion yuan medium-term lending facility operation as it seeks to maintain ample liquidity in the banking system. The bank noted that the one-year operation was carried out via fixed quantity and interest rate bidding, with 182 billion yuan of medium-term lending facility funds maturing this month. The net injection via lending facility alone stood at 118 billion yuan in June. Chinese Premier Li Qiang has stated that reforms and a shift towards a consumption-led economic model will enable China to remain the primary driver of global economic growth. Speaking at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank's annual meeting in Beijing, Li Qiang emphasized that the government is strengthening macro politics, actively expanding domestic demand, and forcefully boosting consumption. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has asked Parliament to swiftly approve an additional $14.7 billion in government spending. He described the nation's economy as being in a desperate situation concerning domestic consumption and exports. Speaking to the National Assembly, Lee stressed the urgent need for this supplementary budget to tackle the severe economic downturn. He also committed to moderating future fiscal spending, emphasizing that reducing the tax shortfall is crucial for healthy government finances. Lee told lawmakers that this decision was made to uphold fiscal soundness and respect the Assembly's authority, calling the current period exceptionally grave. To the US, and budget materials recently released by the Office of the Under-Secretary of Defense detail US President Donald Trump's proposed defense budget for the fiscal year 2026, outlining a strategic shift that prioritizes a 3.8% troop pay rise and substantial investment in high-tech missiles and drones. At $892.6 billion, the defense and national security budget request is flat compared with this year. To manage the overall cost, the proposed budget calls for cutting 7,286 civilian jobs within the Navy, reduces new warship buys to 3 and limits F-35s to 47. The plan also seeks to trim expenses by retiring older, more expensive weaponry. The Labour Department has stated that the number of Americans filing new applications for jobless benefits fell last week, but the unemployment rate could rise in June as more laid-off people struggle to find work. Initial claims for state unemployment benefits dropped 10,000 to a seasonally adjusted 236,000 for the week ending June 21st. The report also showed that the number of people receiving benefits after an initial week of aid, a proxy for hiring, increased 37,000 to a seasonally adjusted 1.974 million during the week ending June 14th. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has extended the department's authority to continue extraordinary cash management measures to keep from breaching the federal debt ceiling by nearly a month. That's until July 24th. In a letter to congressional leaders, Bessent noted that he had determined that the debt issuance suspension period, previously scheduled to expire on Friday, needed to continue. However, the letter did not provide any specific updates to this timing.
Mr. Secretary, this does not pass
now. Now to another one of Donald Trump's feuds, and the president has called Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell terrible in his latest attack on the central bank chief. He said he has 3 or 4 people in mind as contenders for the top Fed. Now, for more on this, we are joined from London by Gianluca Lobafalo, who is the CEO of QW Capital. Thank you very much for joining us here on Q News. So, President Trump has been alternating between threatening to fire Powell and then claiming he's not going to fire him. How do you assess what's going on, and how do these conflicting statements impact the Fed's credibility, market stability?
Hi, thanks everyone. Okay, now if there is one thing that's been common during Trump 1, so the first administration, and the second one has been, as you correctly pointed out, this change of mood with respect to the relationship with the Fed. Now let's clarify few points to start with. Powell was appointed by Trump during the first administration following the non-confirmation of Janet Yellen, who was appointed during Obama administration. So he's a Trump appointee. Powell is a Republican, so let's start with that. Having said that, Trump cannot fire, the White House cannot fire the Fed chair. They can only start a process of eventually asking for the parliament to fire the Fed chairman, but only under specific evidence of misconduct or serious fraud or basically misbehavior. There are none of these possible events. So the probability to build the case against Powell by the White House is close to zero, unless there is something that we don't know, but I strongly doubt. It's basically almost impossible to act against the chairman Powell to end his term before November 26th, when he naturally expires. Yes, they can change the Fed, the famous law that was created in 1913 to establish the Fed, but that would require a majority that at the moment the Republicans don't have in the parliament. So it would require a process of at least 2 years in the best case scenario that basically will defy the purpose, because it will go beyond Powell's natural term that is expiring in November 26. So to me, the probability for Powell to be fired is close to zero to start with.
Okay, and so why does he do it then? Because it does seem that every time he mentions or tries to put the idea out there that he might fire him, the markets go crazy.
Go crazy because the market doesn't like this institutional clash. Clearly, you don't see as a good sign in a moment, particularly in which the US has a huge amount of debt as a stock. So the amount, the existing debt versus GDP. He has to refinance $6 to $7 trillion within this year, and $10 trillion within the next 2 years. So it's clear that every government would love to have the rate close to zero, because you will reduce your interest payment. That's just for people to remind, is $1 trillion at the moment. So it's obvious the interest of the administration to reduce this cost. It will reduce by around 1% the deficit to GDP. So it's a huge number. But obviously, this doesn't depend just on the Fed. To be clear, the Fed, even if the Fed will cut rate, let's put it this way, we are talking about the rates on the very short term. The funding needs for the US is more to the 5-year plus, so 5 to 10 years or 20 years. So that is an indirect implication of, yes, on a shorter term rate, we expect the curve to go down, and so the funding cost to be reduced because of the cut rates by the Fed. But this is a quite far-fetched hypothesis. Obviously, as you may remember, in the fall of 2018, when the Fed was starting to increase rate before the pandemic and reducing what it was at the time, the balance sheet through a QT, so a quantitative tightening, there was the famous declaration by Powell who said the QT is in autopilot and we are increasing rate according to the needs. And then there was this huge fight to which you refer on your question, where Powell was under threat by Trump at the time, that again threatened him to fire him. Again, even in that situation, was basically impossible. Indeed, it didn't happen. Then we had the big market rout, the Fed pivot, and they didn't increase any more rate. And then we had the huge repo crisis in September 19 that triggered the Fed to start a famous QE4 before the pandemic. But they were market driven, was because something happened in the market, was not because of Trump threat.
Now, you've said that it's very, very unlikely that Trump can get rid of his man. As you said, he was the man who appointed him in the first place. But if Trump did, if he found some way of getting rid of his Fed chair, and he replaced him with somebody who is maybe slightly more of an ally or a loyalist, what kind of effect would that have on the market?
Yeah. First of all, if he finds something, you are talking about the fact that if they found a way to prove that there was a misconduct by Powell at the Fed, that would be, to me, a biggest damage than what people realize, in the sense that the market will price a higher risk premium on all the bonds. So frankly, it would be against the purpose of reducing the financing cost for the US debt, because they would be putting into question the reliability of the US system if the Fed chair, that by the way, up to now, to me, has been the best Fed chair since Volcker. So to me, he's been doing a better job than Greenspan, Bernanke, and Yellen. But that is my opinion. But I'm going to the fact, if today they will be proven, and I doubt they have a proof, because otherwise they would have hinted at, there's been a misconduct or one of the serious case for which the Fed chair can be fired, they would put into question the credibility of the US financial system. So the premium will be increasing even more than what we have seen since the last Fed cut. Don't forget, in September 24, we had the famous jumbo cut by Powell of 50 basis points, and the market rallied 80 basis points on the 10 years, meaning that the interest rate on the part that is very relevant for the funding, so the 5 to 10 years, instead of going down, exploded higher. So I'm not too sure that if I were if you're the U.S. administration, I would pursue the way of cutting the short-term rate by the Fed to try to bring the funding cost down. It should be done with different policy.
Well, we're just out of time, but in a word, would Donald Trump be better off just shutting up?
That is not just on this, but I think it's part of the style. It's not even on the tariff. You know that we talked about already in the previous interview. The tariff is a negotiation tool for the Fed, for Trump. Trump wants to reduce the cost of funding, and he will try to do with the famous Mar-a-Lago Accord. I think there will be much more likelihood they will manage to achieve a swap, so an exchange of the foreign holder out of the 10 years treasury into a long-term zero coupon, that it was the famous Mar-a-Lago Accord, to reduce the funding cost. They would be a very smart, market-driven policy, rather than fire the Fed chairman. I doubt, to me, it's close to zero.
Okay, well, thank you very much. From London, Gianluca Lobefalo, who is the CEO of QW Capital, rather. Thank you very much for being here with us on Q News. Now we move on to the latest developments in the economic world in the MENA region. The Borealis Gas Company, in cooperation with Shell and Petronas, has successfully brought the Siena DE development well into production 3 days ahead of schedule. The well is the first of 3 planned under Phase 11 of the Deepwater West Delta Deep Marine project. According to a statement from Egypt's Ministry of Petroleum, actual testing results of the well matched prior engineering studies, with production rates reaching 40 million cubic feet of gas per day. Phase 11 is expected to add up to 130 million cubic feet per day to the company's overall output. The development plan aims to support domestic gas supplies during the summer peak consumption season, while helping reduce import costs and diversify natural gas sources. The governor of the Bank of Israel, Amir Yaron, has acknowledged the losses incurred by the Israeli economy as a result of the 12-day war waged against Iran, revealing that the brief military campaign cost the country an estimated 1% of GDP, equivalent to approximately 20 billion shekels. Speaking to Bloomberg, Yaron asserted that a lasting resolution to the war in Gaza would allow Israel to resume its potential growth. He also stressed that Israel must reevaluate its balance of civilian and defense spending to maintain fiscal responsibility, adding that Prime Minister Netanyahu's government need to revise and increase the 2025 budget. State-affiliated news outlet Qnews has reported that Iran's parliament approved a bill to suspend the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and that Iran's nuclear program would proceed at a faster pace. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Bagher, sharply criticized the IAEA for not issuing even a symbolic condemnation over the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, stressing that the organization has damaged its international credibility. Well, that's almost all we have time for right now. But just before we go, just time to recap the main economic headlines this evening. France's public debt rises 3.3 trillion euros at the end of the first quarter of 2025. US President Donald Trump proposes defense budget for the next fiscal year. And the Bank of Israel acknowledges the 20 billion shekels losses from the 2012 war waged against Iran. Now that concludes our economic bulletin. Don't forget you can follow Q News on our social media platforms. At Q News, EGY is the handle. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more updates here on Q News. Good night.